Okay, welcome back. This is the keynote lecture part of the program. I'm not going to live up to the effusive introductions that Renee just pioneered in the previous panel, partly because our speaker doesn't need any introduction, A, because we all know him, and B, because he was already introduced earlier in the financial panel. But just to say, we're extremely delighted that John Drzik, class of 83, agreed to give this lecture. He's been a great friend of this department. Someone described him as a cheerleader-in-chief of our department, as a member of the advisory council for 10 years. And so with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce John Drzik.
Thanks, Ronnie, for that introduction, even if it wasn't as effusive as you would have liked it to be. It's my great pleasure to be here today for Orphe's 10th anniversary. Today we're here to celebrate that 10th anniversary, and I think there's really a lot to celebrate with the 10 years of Orphe at Princeton. When I arrived at Princeton back in 1979, there was no Orphe department. Certainly, I would have been part of it if it was, but that wasn't a choice on the menu at that point. So I came into a program that was then called Basic Engineering, which I think was the original predecessor of the Orphe department, starting way back in the 60s. But by 1983, it had been renamed the Engineering Management Systems program, so I have a certificate from that program. But I actually graduated with a civil engineering degree. And this has always created a bit of an identity problem for me because I've never really felt like a legitimate civil engineer. I mean, who really deserved that degree. I can't build a bridge, I can't design a water system or supervise the construction of a harbor, or really anything that a civil engineer is supposed to be able to do. My wife, who's a Princeton graduate from the same class as me, reminds me of this frequently when things break down around the house, and then it's sort of a, "Oh, John, you're an engineer, you can fix that, right?" And then there's a bit of a pause, and then there's the, "Oh, I forgot, you're not a real engineer." So to me, the decision 10 years ago that Princeton took to create the Orphe department was a great decision because, amongst other things, I think it gave all of us alumni who had backgrounds like mine at Princeton a clear identity and in a department in the university. And it was crystallized further when the university supported the construction of Sherrod Hall, the new home for Orphe. So I think it's terrifically, I think, given all of us here, current students, faculty, as well as alumni, a real identity on campus. I just want to talk a little bit about Orphe over the last 10 years. It's been really my privilege to be on the advisory council and have a chance to observe some of the developments here for the last decade. And it's very clear this has been a great success. By any measure, Orphe is a real growth story. Vince Poor talked about some of these numbers, but I'll give you a few more just to give you a sense of the development. Obviously, some of you have been here for the whole period and very familiar with these numbers, but I get them every year as part of the advisory council. And it's always impressive, I think, to all of us who are on the advisory council as to how successful this department has been. So you look at undergraduate majors. When the department started, there were 26 in the year 2000. It's going to hit a peak of 65 next year, or in the class of 2011. And classes of Orphe attract the wider Princeton student body as well. Total enrollments have gone from 680 in 2000 to close to 1,000 in 2009. And so Orphe is now the largest department in the engineering school. It's one of the largest on campus. The course enrollment per faculty member of 65 to 70 and majors per faculty member at 12 are the highest in the engineering school by far and amongst the highest on campus. So it's a very, very popular discipline. The grad program has grown from in the 20s to now over 40. The faculty's doubled, the research expenditure's doubled. So basically on every metric you can look at over the last 10 years, Orphe's grown by 50 to 100%. So I think it's pretty clear there's a high demand for the subject matter of Orphe, a lot of interest in its popular department, and I think those who have created it, many of whom are in this room, should be congratulated on great success over the last 10 years in creating the energy behind Orphe. And the success is very much success in the numbers, but not just in the numbers. I think the quality of the research that's being done by the faculty is extremely distinguished in its field. The caliber of the grad students is rising, as Vince Poor referenced earlier by talking about the acceptance rate hitting a new high. And Orphe is really a unique department here. There are similar departments in other universities, but they're not identical to Orphe in character. I mean, every university has an economics department, a history department, but not everyone has an Orphe department. And I think this is there are some that are close, but this one is pretty unique. And I think as a department, it's a great asset for Princeton. It has been and can continue to be a terrific asset and a great bridge, a great fit for Princeton in that it bridges between the liberal arts and traditional engineering. So maybe in my role as chief cheerleader here, I just give another endorsement to Orphe. I think as a real terrific department for Princeton to have something that the university should be very proud of. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Orphe in the financial crisis. We talked about it in John's panel a little bit, but obviously the core discipline of Orphe in statistics and optimization and stochastics, which I think at the last advisory council meeting we termed SOS as sort of the core discipline of Orphe. And the application of these techniques, there has been a major application in finance, and in fact these techniques sparked a revolution in finance, which we're talking about around the panel in terms of product innovation, risk measurement, portfolio optimization, and so forth. And these same innovations have been in the papers a lot recently as featuring prominently as a cause of the crisis. So I guess one of the questions I wanted to dig into a little bit is, are the quantitative techniques associated with Orphe to blame for the near meltdown of the financial system? And kind of look at that at the crisis through that lens. So just 2 minutes of background on my angle on this. I've had a 25-year career as a consultant, as John said. When I was introduced, I was part of a strategy consultant, but then I started our risk management practice at Oliver Wyman back in the early 90s. I was a risk management consultant for about a dozen years, and now I'm a manager of both strategy and risk management consultants. So I've been close to the front lines of the crisis, though perhaps not really right in them. We've been kind of observers. And there's been a lot written about causes of the crisis, and I won't get into excess liquidity and the subprime bubble and these sorts of complex securitization and so forth. I want instead, because we're here at Orphe, to really look at this angle of what was the role of quantitative methods before, during, and after the crisis, and what can we learn from the crisis in that regard. And before jumping into that, though, I'll jump to the end and say I'm going to end up reaching the conclusion, probably not surprising to people in this room, but perhaps surprising to some outside, that actually I think to prevent another crisis of this type, the world needs more Orphe, not less Orphe. So, I'll try to explain why. But before going into the crisis itself, let me start a bit by talking about the pre-crisis period. I think looking at the period, say, from the early 90s through the point of the crisis, this was really a golden age for financial engineering and for the financial sector more generally. There were tremendous advances in finance theory and its applications. There was an explosion of product innovation. There was significant development of risk management techniques with a lot of better data capture, more sophisticated modeling, and so forth. So there was, it really was a terrific age, and for people coming from backgrounds like those coming out of Orphe, to look for careers in finance, and there was a high demand for this at the time. I think the crisis then obviously exposed some pretty serious weaknesses in what was happening in financial institutions and, failures of practitioners. So you can look at practitioners, whether in banks, investment banks, rating agencies, or even consultants like myself, really didn't quite get risk management right. And so when you want to look at the failures that came from the crisis, I'm going to generalize and talk about three broad failures that I see from the crisis, these are failures that I've also observed outside the financial sector, and which I think the lessons of the financial sector are there for to be learned in applying these types of quantitative techniques and applying in both product design and in risk management. So first, in terms of a first failure I want to observe is that the control environment in financial institutions didn't keep up with product innovation. So if you think about the areas of a financial institution that draw on the ORFI curriculum, there's sort of the front office side, sort of trading and product structuring and so forth, and then there's sort of a middle office side in risk management. So the first pieces are risk takers, and the latter are monitoring and measuring the risk takers. Both of them are relying on the same underlying, to some degree, the same underlying financial modeling techniques. So there's an old expression along the lines that if you want to engineer cars to drive faster, you also have to design better brakes. I think in this circumstance, I think the design to go faster got ahead of the brakes, and in the case at least of many financial institutions, the pace of development was faster on the product innovation side. The control environment didn't keep up, and this phenomenon wasn't fully recognized by the senior leadership of the organization. So, quoting from the Turner report, this was a post-mortem analysis of what happened in the crisis done by the Financial Services Authority in the UK. Dare Turner is the chairman. And his quote was, the predominant assumption was that increasing complexity, this is of products, had been matched by the evolution of mathematically sophisticated techniques for measuring and managing risk. But mathematical sophistication ended up not containing risk, but instead providing false assurance that other prima facie indicators of risk could be safely ignored. And I think this was behind, I think, some of the reasons that people didn't intervene, despite the fact that there were other indicators of risk that were there to be seen. Second broad category was the failures within the modeling discipline itself, and I want to highlight a few different ones here. In my experience, there's too much focus by model builders in areas where there's data rather than where there's risk. So, because it's easier to build models when you have rich data sets. So where there's daily price series and so forth, there was a tremendous amount of analytical energy thrown at these data sets, whereas there were other broad areas of risk that weren't approached with quite the same energy and focus because there wasn't a lot of data to work with, yet focusing on those probably would have in some cases added a lot more value. Second issue, and it's sort of related, is that looking at model building, using short horizon samples when you're trying to judge risks where long horizon data is really needed. I mean, a good example there is that few risk models looking at mortgage instruments even considered scenarios of like a 30% housing price drop. And I think that sort of speaks to this point that there were, certainly if you looked over a recent period of time, even 25 years, you might not see that scenario, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. And then a third point is that in many cases, in order to build a model, the easiest thing to do is to assume away variables that are difficult to deal with. It makes the model more elegant and more tractable, but on the other hand, it makes it potentially a lot less useful. So using another expression sometimes used to describe analysts, that I think in some cases we were looking for keys under a lamppost. It was sort of easier to ignore the dark areas entirely than to try to account for them in the way the models are being built. So, and the last point I wanted to make about the model building discipline itself relates to a point that one of the panelists in the financial crisis also made, which is that all of us in the model building community would probably benefit from having a bit more humility. So that, because all models, even good ones, have flaws, and making those flaws clear to the user and how the model is going to be applied would have a lot of benefit. But my final point around failures in the crisis comes back to a couple of the comments I made during the panel, which is that I don't see the primary failure underpinning a crisis as a risk modeling failure or even a risk management failure, but rather failure of governance. And the right questions weren't being asked at the very top of institutions or, for that matter, in the regulatory community. There were institutions that over-relied on models. Some over-relied on the rating agencies. Some over-relied on their own internal models. So you can blame the models, but on the other hand, the decision to rely on the models was ultimately a governance choice, not a technical one. And that was an area of critical failure. I think there are also risk management functions in organizations, in financial institutions that were under-resourced, which again is another governance choice, how much resource to put behind that function. In some, the risk management function had the right information, brought it to the attention of someone, but didn't have the organizational power to act on it because of the way the organization was designed. And in other cases, the risk function wasn't really integrated into the firm's strategic planning and thinking at all. So you didn't have the risk involved in a sector influencing significantly the capital allocation internally in the organization. And then finally, I made the point earlier around incentive structures. And again, it's a governance choice. How do you want to pay people? And these incentive structures created moral hazard in many cases. And they weren't risk adjusted. They weren't based on the time horizon of the instruments that people were trading, and hence led to an amplified set of positions that might not have gotten there under a different incentive regime. So all of these points that I'm making now are really governance failures, not technical ones, and I think it points to a direction, I think, for to tie the technical community and its development much more into broader governance developments and organizational developments, both in individual organizations, but also more broadly. So now, stepping back from those particular points on the crisis and looking forward to what are the implications of this for ORFI and its role in the financial sector. I think it's clear to people involved in the sector that we need quantitative models. It isn't a question of, okay, the models didn't work, let's throw them out and go back to the way it used to be when we just judged these things without any quantitative techniques. We see a more investment now in building stronger quantitative modeling infrastructure. So they're going to be a core part of any significant risk management infrastructure in a financial institution going forward. We might not need some of the product innovation that took place. You could certainly say our CDO squared is going to come back anytime soon. I wouldn't necessarily bet on that one. Some of those could go, but in terms of the role of quantitative modeling, financial engineering is going to be fairly significant in the sector, both in risk management, also on the front line. And importantly, I think, in the executive suite of these financial institutions, I think it's very important that the managers become more literate in the models and methods on which their businesses depend. And not all of them had the background to do that through this last crisis. I think increasingly that will become very important. And the symmetrical point, coming back to a comment I made earlier, is that I think the risk people who are chief risk officers and in the risk function would benefit from being more than just the chief technician, but rather someone who also has a balance of models and business judgment, so they can have the voice in the room when critical decisions are being made that are at the risk-return boundary. So I think we're going to need more ORFI in the financial sector, but some things about the discipline could productively change. I think models could change. Coming back to some of the comments I made around some of the flaws in the modeling discipline, I'll take a quote from Andy Lowe, who points a direction for modeling by saying, by incorporating fear and greed into models and risk management protocols explicitly rather than assuming them away, we believe that the financial models of the future will be considerably more successful, even if mathematically less elegant and tractable. So I think that's a direction. How can you incorporate fear and greed? It's easier said than done. But I think these are the kinds of things that, rather than trying to make the models more elegant, would be beneficial and potentially make them more useful. I think also looking within the risk management discipline itself, I think there'll be more emphasis on stress testing, and there should be, versus just pure statistical modeling. Both are necessary within an overall modeling platform, but you can definitely see roles for more stress and scenario testing. But ultimately, the risk management discipline, I think, has to evolve to be more than just models. It has to be models and judgment. That judgment is not just incorporating judgment around model risk itself, but also when to rely on model output and when to look at other indicators in order to judge the severity of a crisis as it's emerging. And so sometimes you need multiple looks at a risk to understand it. If you rely strictly on one metric within an institution, it's not enough. So, and it's a question of when to shift from one metric to other metrics. This is an art, more of a judgment that has to be honed by the risk community. It's not a technical question at that point. A kind of separate point around where could ORFI go with respect to financial markets is I had a question earlier around systemic risk. And you think about financial markets and financial firms as itself a complex system with lots of moving parts. Change the regulation here, what happens to the different players? If you change the way or change what's happening to market signals, what would happen to the way participants would react? And it seems to me there's an operations research solution potentially, or a way of approaching this type of angle to the financial system that could be interesting, trying to understand the dynamics of the whole system and trying to look for actions, whether by regulators or by individual institutions, which would reduce its complexity and its risk. And this could be a potentially interesting field right now, certainly very relevant to some of the questions that are being asked in the regulatory community. And the same type of thinking, I think, could also be applied in an individual firm. If you look at their actors who are risk takers and the risk managers and how they're going to react to changes that emerge in policies that could be policy set by the firm or incentives set by the firm, and what would you think would happen to the system as a whole? But I think we also need to look more deeply at governance issues. And because that was, to me, the primary flaw that emerged in the crisis. And it's really thinking about how can we develop an organizational model that handles complex risks and that deals with issues that are low frequency and high severity, and yet, so they have to be in the background all the time in the way decisions are being made, and yet at the same time they might not be front and center every day. And so I think there's a potential link here between the techniques of ORFI and the technical skills being built here, and then policy development that's building on those techniques, because you have people setting policies in relation to these technical developments, and that linkage, I think, needs to be stronger if we're going to develop a more resilient infrastructure in individual institutions or more generally. And so at Princeton, that could mean a deeper connection, for example, between this department and the Woodrow Wilson School, which I think would be a fruitful way of thinking about, is there a governance, a connection between the technical developments here and policy development there, and how can they be cross-fertilized in productive ways that could potentially point to answers to some of the issues that emerged in the financial crisis. The final comment around where this could go, or what are some of the things that would be interesting to develop solutions for, is around institutional memory. I think one of the things that became clear in this crisis, but it's became clear in prior ones as well, is that in the financial sector we seem to learn the same lessons over and over again, and there isn't the institutional memory embodied somewhere in organizations to be able to remember what happened in the prior crisis and how policies needed to be strengthened in order to protect the institution. And I don't know if this is in Orphe's scope per se, but I think the value of the methods that are being developed here would go up significantly if we could figure out a way for institutions to have more institutional memory and be able to draw on the lessons of the past as they go forward in both their strategic planning and as well as their development of the other functions in the company, including risk management. I think it comes back to that low frequency and high severity events are just simply not natural things for people to grapple with. And so if you haven't been through one before, it's easy to assume that it will never happen. And for a lot of people who are only in their role for a few years, a lot of times you can try to assume them away. And this could come into whether it's a political sphere or someone who's a chief executive for just a few, only expecting to stay in their role for a few years. How much time do you want to invest in an event that might only happen once every 20 or 30 years and might not happen in your term? And yet at the same time, if all institutional policy is based on a shorter term horizon, we're just not thinking on the right horizon for some of the issues that arise, and not only in the financial sphere, but outside as well. But net, I think, thinking about the impact of the crisis on the need for Orphe, I still think it's the net need is going to be higher, not lower. Perhaps the need will be on somewhat different lines. We'll need to tie into other areas, but I think the need is going to grow. I mean, as one example of this demand, if you look, the consulting market as a whole in 2009 was shrinking. Our risk management practice in North America grew by more than 50%. So there's been sort of a continued demand for building more risk management infrastructure. And I think there's real opportunity here. I mean, everyone knows there were flaws. Everyone knows we need to kind of reinvent this to some degree. And there's a real opportunity for, I think, an intellectual rebirth, if you will, of risk management and financial engineering. And I think the Orphe department can be very much a part of this. Now, moving beyond finance for just a few additional comments, there are other applications for the core curriculum of Orphe well beyond finance. I mean, we had the energy panel here a few minutes ago. I think there are great applications for Orphe's curriculum in the energy sector. Obviously, there's some of the sector is because it's similar to the financial sector. There's commodity price risks and trading, carbon trading, and so forth. But there's also questions around the optimization of the investment portfolio, how much to invest behind renewables, how much to invest in new exploration and production, what's the right balance in the portfolio, particularly in light of other uncertainties going forward around what energy prices will be. The energy sector also has in its projects, which are long horizon and very significant investments, there's a lot of risk analysis around the projects themselves because there's a mix of geologic risks, country risks, because a lot of the energy isn't in particularly friendly environments. You have operating risks in the projects themselves and so forth. And so the discipline of being able to look holistically at risk, I think, is quite important both at the project level and the institution level in the energy sector. Healthcare, I think, is another interesting field for the Orphe techniques where I think the application is more embryonic today, but where I think there'll be considerable scope for growth going forward. And then I think also the public sector is an interesting area. One of the things I've been involved in over the last few years is a project at the World Economic Forum called the Global Risk Project, where we look each year at what are the major risks that the world at large is facing, not just in the financial sector, but things like pandemics, terrorism, water shortages, food shortages, and so forth, and what kind of impact they can have more broadly. And one of the things that we did as an offshoot of that was a project with the OECD looking at the evolution of risk management functions within governments. And there's been a role that I wouldn't quite call it a country risk officer that's been created yet, but it's in that same vein of having a department that looks across all of the risks that a country faces and tries to apply quantitative techniques to measuring and monitoring these risks, looking at their correlations, looking at ways in which they can be mitigated, looking at the overall resilience of the resources that are against those risks. And in this OECD project, we showcased 6 different governments which had gotten to different places over the last several years. In the U.S., the place where this unit sits is within the Department of Homeland Security. But in other governments, it's in different places. But they were all developing on a similar course to what I would have looked at as the development path of a risk management function in a private sector institution in terms of its role, in terms of looking first at quantifying and aggregating risks and then reporting it into and communicating it to relevant actors in the government. And I think this is an early stage thing, but I think has a lot of potential in, again, building a little bit more resilience and putting a little bit more focus and priority on risks that have low frequency and high severity. So I think in short, I see ample applications of the ORFI discipline in finance, in energy, in healthcare, in the public sector, and elsewhere, wherever there's really need for risk measurement and management, resource allocation, decision-making under uncertainty. The demand for methods to approach these issues is going to grow. I think it'll be enabled as there's better data, more technology to deal with that data. It'll enable the application of better methods, which should produce more accurate results. And so I think the career opportunities for people with know-how in this field are going to be very strong. So those of you who are recent graduates or current students, I think you're going to be in demand for a long time. There's a lot of pull from the private sector, and as I said, increasingly, I think from the public sector for people with this skill set. And I think more generally, the methods of ORFI will be an increasingly critical part of modern engineering. I was here last year, and Norm Augustine gave a talk and listed a number, I can't remember exactly, you may remember, Bob, how many features of the modern engineering discipline he highlighted. But as we were counting, there were about 6 of them that related to ORFI. It's clear that even coming back to what I said earlier, even though I may not feel like a civil engineer, I do feel like an engineer, modern engineer, given that I think the ORFI science fits very, very much in that domain, and that I think Princeton is and can continue to be a leader in this very important field. So let me close my talk with a reference to a concept called the known, unknown, and the unknowable. Some of you may be familiar with this. It goes by the shorthand, sometimes KUU. It was originally outlined in a Scientific American article by Ralph Gomery, and more recently it's been applied to financial risks by a group of Wharton professors that I know from my affiliation with the Wharton Financial Institutions Center. And essentially what the concept does is divides, in this case financial risk-taking, it was into 3 buckets. There were the known risks. So think of these as risks where the odds are known, even if the outcome isn't. So think of a dice roll or really any casino game, roulette, wheel spin. You know the odds, but you don't know whether you're going to win or lose. So there's still risk, but it's a known risk. You think of unknown risks as risks that can be named. So you say that I can see that risk is there, but you can't really judge the odds. Or certainly and obviously there's a spectrum between the known and the unknown of how well modeled the risk is. But think of the unknown as being at one extreme and the known at the other. And then the unknowable are really different in kind. These are risks that you can't even name, but you know that they add to the total risk in the pie. So you can't name them yet, but you know that there's something out there and something else might happen to us. So we may encounter these risks. So if you look at this KUU framework, looking at through this lens and what is the ongoing challenge for our discipline here in Orphe and in those of us who are practitioners using Orphe techniques, I think it's really to develop methods that, on the one hand, trying to move things from the unknown to the known, and also move things from the unknowable to the unknown. But I think it's also trying to figure out how to deal better with the unknowable, because inevitably there's going to be a piece that's out there that's still unknowable. I think a few years ago we got a bit overconfident, particularly in the financial sector. We thought we had moved more risks into the known than we actually had. And I think hopefully we've learned to approach the unknown and the unknowable with a little bit more humility. But still, my personal view looking at the last 10 to 20 years is that we're further along on the path today toward knowing the unknown and knowing the unknowable than we were when Orphe was founded in 1999. And I think we'll be even further along 10 years from now as these techniques advance and as people start to apply them and learn from how they're being used. I think this is a department that can contribute significantly to developments in many fields in that direction through its research and by broadening the understanding of everyone in this community and outside to the issues involved with the discipline. So I think in closing, let me just say I'm delighted to be here for the 10th, and I think when we're back here for the 20th anniversary of Orphe, we'll have a lot more to celebrate even than we do today. Thank you.
If you go to the undergraduate programs, and I think you'll see a tremendous commonality. Basically a pre-business group of students who have math skills. And in that sense, we have a community. And in academia, I think it's important to have a community because this is where we draw graduate students who compete against other, where we have to compete. These are the schools that we most often compete with head-to-head for graduate students. But you go to the undergrads, we can change who we hire. We can change what graduate students we admit. But the undergraduates are fairly consistent population from school to school, among the schools that have departments like this. Not every school does. Is that a fair assessment from your experience as you looked around at other schools?
Yeah, so I think you're making a couple of points I totally agree with. There are departments that are similar to Orphe, but not every have a similar program. But it's not true not everywhere we recruit. So if I look at some of the other places we recruit, whether it's Harvard or Yale or whatever, we tend to be looking for people who are, say, we're still, in my mind, we're still looking for Orphe, right? But it's looking, is it applied math, or is it someone who did quantitative economics, or is it something like some blend of those things? That tends to be people who are attracted to our field. I would say we did a analysis once and saw that it was, I think, economics, engineering, and mathematics were the three most common majors. So if it wasn't an Orphe program, so you take out the middle, it was probably the other two things that we were looking for. But you're right. We would look at people who are coming from the comparable departments of Orphe. I think it's a good to have a community. But on the other hand, this is still a pretty unique kind of program in that it isn't replicated at every school. And I think even amongst the schools that have something similar, I'd say the angle is somewhat different. And at least, and maybe this is obviously biased in this regard, I still would probably hire from this department first relative to the others that are even comparables in terms of the background that people get.
John, you mentioned the lack of institutional memory hurting as the things started to spin away. What role do you think the shifting of the ownership of the financial firms from partnerships to corporations, where it went principal to more principal agencies, played in the way that played out?
Yeah, I think it certainly was made a difference, though I'm not sure it was the decisive difference. If I look at Goldman Sachs went from a partnership to a corporate model. but there were some partnerships. Lehman remained, and despite having all the incentives you would think of a partnership to manage risk well and sort of survive through a crisis like this, and with this, and even had the compensation incentives of the equity to say, don't want to lose the value that we've been accumulating all these years. It wasn't the perfect solution. So I think there's, and yet at the same time, other institutions which were in a corporate ownership structure, but perhaps had a partnership background, had just in the culture a much stronger risk management discipline, and Goldman, I think, is an example of that. So I think it's hard to, I would tend to agree with, I think, your underlying point, which is a partnership structure would tend to put more of a natural focus on risk management because partners have basically their life wealth at stake, and therefore have an incentive to control and limit the risk-taking of individuals in the institution to things that can be contained. But at the same time, I don't think it's not the only solution. It wasn't a perfect solution, and I think Lehman is an example of that.
Related to what you're saying about incentives, I mean, most of the financial firms tended to kill the bonus structure of compensation, especially for traders. I mean, most of my colleagues would probably defend to the tenure system. But they could both, have equal negative sides. I mean, if you had to reinvent the compensation structure of financial firms, would you retain the bonus structure, or would you think there's a better way in terms of how the firm to compensate?
Well, I think, variable compensation is necessary. So I think you're saying, would you keep a bonus model rather than just move everybody to kind of a fixed salary model? I think you've got to have a variable compensation model, at least in my view, because it's the way of managing the volatility against the revenue volatility that you'll naturally have in the firm. So you want to match that to some degree. But I would say where the compensation structures were off is, it comes back to the point Frank was making. You had a lot of people tied into a short-term accounting profit realization type of model. So if you were trading or building some kind of complex product, you would the profit of your personal book or your unit would be measured, and you would be paid off of that figure, which is sort of an accounting earnings figure. In many firms, this wasn't risk adjusted, nor was it paid out over the time horizon that the position was held, but rather on some kind of mark-to-market basis. And so I think in there were two flaws that I think are correctable. We did a survey of across financial institutions right after the crisis started, I think in 2000 and late 2008, or maybe it was even before Lehman. I think we were looking at how was compensation factoring into this, and you found that at that point there were only about 15% of our universe of firms actually had those issues addressed in terms of risk and time horizon. Now they were then saying, I think 70% were saying they wanted to develop in that direction, or 75% is a fairly good block that were moving in that direction. Whether they'll actually stick to it, I think, is a question. I think to some degree, 2009 was a great year for the financial sector, again, at least in the investment banking part of the sector. And so you'd say maybe things are back to normal, and that would be unfortunate, I think, for the installation of probably what would be better compensation methods that people were starting to agree to in the wake of the immediate wake of the crisis. But I think ultimately some kind of design that reflects the fact that you do need to create incentives for people to generate profits for the firm, but also reflects the risk that's taken to do that, and the nature of the position and the duration of the position that's being taken is the right direction.
How do you make the downside risk comparable to the upside potential on that?
You can't. I mean, I think that's why I don't think you can't eliminate moral hazard entirely. At least I don't see the way. way. I haven't seen a proposal for a way to do that. So I think this is where ultimately there have to be, just have to be limits in terms of you can't just have a purely, you can't rely entirely on incentives to govern the risk management. There have to be other types of controls in institutions because there will be that underlying trader's option that's there. That's sort of a moral hazard at the root of the system, because you can't really create the same downside for people that will have on the upside. I mean, they take a bad position, they can just move they can leave, right? And so they've lost their job, but they've lost a lot more than that in terms of the firm. But it's quite hard to see. I can't see my way to a way to have a rational compensation framework and eliminate that moral hazard entirely. So it's a difficult problem from a regulatory angle. There was a question earlier, which I didn't comment on during the panel, but around what's the role of regulators in compensation? I don't think regulators can dictate what compensation method should be applied, but I think as part of supervision, in terms of looking at the risk management of a banking organization, one can look at what are the incentive structures that are in place, and are they creating undue moral hazard? There's no way of eliminating it all, but you can look at are there better and worse practices out there, and use the supervisory process to steer in the right direction. I don't think you can give rules, but I think you can give that type of guidance, and maybe things will be a little bit better.